In the video, he began by pointing out, and if you weren't here with us, we're talking about the Bible and tattoos. And the question is it right to get a tattoo? And then somewhere along the way, they kind of threw in piercings and things. So they kind of lumped that all into one big category. So that's kind of the topic of conversation. But he began the video by talking about some of the faulty arguments that are made with regard to this particular topic. And he did go to the Bible. We'll read a few verses, some of which are abused for the sake of kind of making some of those arguments that we dismissed. Also, he talked about several principles that kind of are the overarching principles when it comes to really any issue of such a nature. And when we say an issue of such a nature, what we really mean is that it's an issue that, while the answer isn't always clear-cut, it should lead us to ask a series of questions about that issue. Because, and I believe it was Brother Bob Bauer who was here visiting with us, pointed out, things that are good can become instruments of evil, or instruments of things that are very, very bad, or lead us to bad places. So it's not just this issue, it's many issues that we just simply need to ask ourselves a series of questions about. And some of those questions were, is it proper, stewardship? Are we concerned about, our image? Does it affect our ability to, not only live righteous lives, but teach, people about righteousness? And that's kind of the minute-and-a-half version of what the video had to say. But wanted to go ahead and open it up to kind of get your comments. This is an issue that, affects affects us in a number of ways. There are millions of people who have, tattoos, whether they are in the church, whether they are out of the church. It's something that our society sees as, very prevalent. I think, I don't know if I pointed it out last week, but I know it was in the bulletin in the little blurb on the back. There are over 20,000 different tattoo parlors in operation, and that's like a 2011 number, I believe. But there are 20,000, of these in operation today. So it's, obviously something that is in, demand, and people on a regular basis go and receive, tattoos for various purposes and various, reasons, or with various intentions. So it is an issue that we do need to know how to talk about it. And while we may not always agree on everything that's talked about, it is something that, we do need to talk about and do need to have the ability to discuss. So anyhow, having said all of that, I'm going to kind of throw it open to you and your thoughts. I know we had lots of hands up at the end of class, people wanting to share, but we had to simply shut it down. So your thoughts. So in a week's time, you all got it all figured out, right? That's a good thing. Yeah, Sam.
It troubles me a little bit that I think it's borderline addict because for deaf people that have going way back. In my memory, I can think of many people who put memories that they never wanted to forget.
Yeah, good way to start, and a very good point. And there are several things that Sam said, if you didn't hear him, that I'll kind of repeat that are things that I think play heavily into this. But before I do that, Josh. I didn't hear him. Okay. All right. I think that's one of the points that, and I know you weren't here, Josh, but that's one of the points that was brought out in the video. Sandy and then Glenn. Okay. All right. So image of God is important. Keeping that. All right, Glenn. Okay. Okay. So I'll make sure I repeat, and if you ever wonder why we have this facing the audience, it's so people online can hear. It's our best solution that we have. So if you could, do your best to kind of speak up when you do make comments. But so far, what we have is Brother Sam brought out several interesting points about, is this really in the Bible, and are we running the risk of adding to the scripture here by binding this on people? And we'll talk about that. Also being judgmental and the necessity for us to be more concerned about the purity of heart in a personal way. Josh and Norsworthy brought out that if you're trying to preach to other people, that a tattoo might actually be a hindrance to that because of some of the perceptions, no doubt, in our world. And Sandy brought out the fact that the idea that you can or may run the risk of not upholding the image of God when you cover yourself with tattoos. In other words, you go overboard. Is that the word that's appropriate? Okay. All right. Who else wants to share your thoughts about the matter? Bill.
Hundreds of names that he looked at that weren't offensive. The other thing is, I think that
gets a lot of tattoos that are very visible to people. They have to keep in mind that they're making their path as a Christian more difficult than it would be if they didn't have all of those tattoos. Whether it be right or wrong, they're still creating a path more difficult for themselves. Sandy said it's hard to gain employment. I read something the other day that a lot of companies are rewriting their guidelines for their employees on, and they have to include tattoos. Like they can't just say if it's an offensive tattoo, it needs to be covered up, because to some people it's offensive, to others it's not. So now they just say you have a tattoo, it has to be covered up. And then the last thing that I want to say is we have to remember Jesus talking to the scribes and the Pharisees about how they were putting so much importance on the outward appearance and not, we talk about whitewashed tombs, and put so much importance on the outward appearance of things rather than what's inside your heart. And, we know that we're going to be judged with the same judgment that we use. So if we're just looking at somebody and saying, oh, they look like a horrible person because they get tattoos, then we better be prepared to, be judged the same way that we're going to be judged. So I think, I'm kind of in the middle. I talked to you last week about it a little bit. I'm not for, I'm not against. I think, it's, if somebody asked me, I'd say, think about it until you're 30 and decide if you want to get a tattoo. And then if you do, that's your decision, and you'll get to live with it. I'm not going to judge you one way or the other.
Okay, yeah, very good. And again, for our folks online, Bill brings out a couple of points. We need to be careful about judging, and I think Sam was kind of, hinting on along that line too, especially when we're judging simply by outward appearance, of things. Also, if you do, get tattoos that, let's just use the word excessive, by employer or just life standards in general, that you do make your life perhaps more difficult in some arenas, and unfortunately some of those arenas are rather large arenas, employment and other things. And I know that I'm not sure that it is now, but even the military when I was in had a policy that you couldn't have you could not get a tattoo that was showing beyond the borders of your uniform. Now, not unfortunately, but I mean, fortunately, they didn't make that backward applicable, because obviously some guys were going to have trouble with that. So, anyhow, anyone else? Dennis.
Yeah, Bill mentioned what's in the heart of a man, what's inside of a man, and it's more important than maybe sometimes the external work. And so, when it goes to something that doesn't appear to be,
You don't have to. You don't want to.
I'm saying Bill mentioned what's important is what's in a person's heart, and not necessarily what people see on the exterior. And when it comes to situations where God has not approved or condemned, the important thing probably would be the intent of our heart. Why did we go about doing something? Did we, examining ourselves? So the intent of why people do things can be right or wrong with God. And so it's good to examine yourselves before you do anything, before you speak, before you respond, before you help somebody. What is your intent, and how are you going to go about doing this? And when you examine yourself, then you know when you made a decision, you put, God's thoughts into your thinking process. And so in things like this, it's good to help people make decisions. it's good to, like we pointed out, things that could be positive and negative about, well, specifically we're talking about tattoos. Let them know so that they can make an educated decision and make sure, because I know it appears that sometimes people make decisions for the wrong reason, that they're encouraged to because of peers, or maybe they're lashing out. That could be a wrong intent to do something, but you can make a decision on because a loved one meant something to you, you made a decision based on that. So the intent of the heart here in this situation would be a big indicator between you and God are right.
Good. All right. I think everybody heard that one. So I'm not going to repeat it, but anyone else? Shirley.
Years ago, years ago, I was a smoker, and a lady was giving me Bible studies at the time, and I said to her, we were coming along nicely, and I said, well, what do I do about this? And you stop smoking yet? And she said, don't worry about that, Jesus will take care of it. And we studied, and sure enough, we did. So I think our major point is what everybody else is saying is to keep our eyes on Him. And all these things are taken care of. If she had said to me, oh, we don't about this, and then the other example I have is, and this was many years ago too. My husband was overseas and I was alone with 3 small children. And a Baptist minister, I'm sorry if anybody here is Baptist, but he said to me, somebody smoke here? And I said, yes, I do. He said, I'm sorry, y'all developed me as a smoker. So I could have been a Baptist except for that. I'm glad. So that's all I can say.
I am going to write that story down. It's good. I mean, it demonstrates several of the points that we've been talking about. But let's get everybody in, and then I'll share mine.
I didn't see the video as I covered up, but I think it's also important to remember that sometimes something like this has to do whether or not in these days we can put on God in the future, and that may actually be the advantage to reach out to other people who are struggling, who might have that connection with the person because of the tattoos. That might actually also reach into the population that we have on our team.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, in retrospect, I can see that certainly applying. I mean, it's hard to think of that in advance, but I mean, sure.
My nephew is a tattoo artist. He's so talented. He's chosen. He's also a Christian. He doesn't belong to the Church of Christ, but they live in Los Angeles. He appeals to a very wide range of people, and I believe he does show Jesus' light to them when they come into that tattoo parlor and they're making decisions about putting something on themselves that's going to be permanent or semi-permanent. As we go along, the culture changes. We found ways to remove them, although it's quite painful. So whatever your decision is, you need to make sure it's a good one. But I don't personally believe there's anything wrong if you feel strongly about making a statement on yourself with a tattoo. I don't personally do it. I have members of my family who are Christian who do it. They go to church. They're also in a different area of the country. This isn't Los Angeles, and things are a little bit different out there. If you work for Google and you have tattoos, it's okay. There's a lot of different cultures within subcultures within this culture, and people of a certain age were raised differently they have a different perspective when it comes to tattoos versus the young people today. So, I think there's a tempering involved when you look at things, and I think that it's important that if you are going to put something on your body, I think those words are seen by everyone, so you need to make sure what you're saying is something that you really stand for, and it's not just a flippant thing you do one day. So, that's my opinion.
Okay. All right. Very, very good. Did everybody hear? Okay. Anyone else want to share? Polly, and then Joyce. Yeah. Yeah, no, very, very good point. Very good. Yeah, Joyce.
McDonald's sometimes gives our children gadgets, only they're just temporary, but it's still kind of instilling, the okay, all right, stigma about it, And I personally feel that if it offends me for myself to do it, if I feel that it's wrong for me to do it, I better not do it because it's going to be sin for me. But if somebody else doesn't feel that way, if they're not finding it to be a sin, I'm not going to judge them and say different.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Anyone else? Mike? Oh, I thought you were standing there for a reason, man.
Well, I guess back in 2002, I got my first tattoo, and I was borderline. My parents didn't like it, but I wasn't ready for the backlash that I would get. So then I went to free market, which if you guys don't know is Christian University, and the support that I got from all the professors and people that really kind of helped me understand that it might have been at the time, it might have been kind of like a shock. Like I got it, I wasn't expecting to get something like that quick. But then when they told me 9 times out of 10 people that are going to see it that are more on the conservative Christian side are going to go straight to the Old Testament. But they don't go to the Old Testament for everything. It's just they pick and choose which things to go back to the Old Testament for and the New Testament. But it says just know the reason why you got it. Kind of like what you guys said. Not right or wrong for each person. Granted, I wouldn't go get something that like making people on me or anything like that. I would be withdrawn, but personally, I don't think it's anything wrong with it. And just the professors and students that we are really helped me understand that. Know that the person is human. We're all human. We don't judge each other, but we don't have a final say. It's God. And we're at peace with it.
Okay. Very good. Anyone else? No? All right. Well, I'll share with you my thoughts about it, and not that they're any more relevant than yours or really any different. But let's start with the video. I think the video had some interesting points in it, but I think that starting off with faulty arguments that people make is a good way to start. But then I think he demonstrated the thing that he had a problem with in his own arguments. He committed what you might call categorical fallacies all throughout the video. For instance, at one point, if you were paying attention, it sounded as if getting a tattoo would be the same thing as injecting your body with heroin. And he made those two things equal. When most of us are going to acknowledge, whether we're for or against or we're just neutral on tattoos, that's just not really a valid argument. Some of the evidence that he gave was just, I think Bill kind of pointed this out, was nothing more than anecdotal evidence. And everybody has a story. I mean, I can tell you about a story about a person who got a tattoo, got an infection, and had to go to the hospital. But I could also tell you stories about people who, are the opposite of that. Anecdotal evidence matters very, very little when you're talking about, arguments and arguing things. There were a couple times where he, equivocated almost in the formulation of his arguments. In other words, this means this here, but then when we get over here, we change the actual definition of what we're talking about. So in the course of pointing out, that people sometimes make, and I'll just be blunt about it, dumb arguments, he makes some pretty dumb arguments. And Bill said that was slant, and I would agree that he does try to slant the facts in a certain direction. And I certainly feel the guy who's he interviewed on the video he regretted his tattoos, and he experienced a lot of backlash because of his tattoos, and that's great. But his whole story is nothing more than a personal anecdote. It's one person's experience. It's not what the Bible says about anything. Now, I even kind of disagree a little bit with what he said about the argument. Quite frankly, I think that the Old Testament passages about the whole cutting your body and putting tattoos on there, I think there is a principle there that we can argue from. But I don't think it's the principle that most people use. I think the point is that if your intention is wrong, and you bear that mark in your body, then that mark is going to be wrong too. You remember, he does a pretty good job of explaining what that whole context is about, and about how it was pagan worship, and about how they were marking their bodies as a show of devotion to these pagan gods. Make no bones about it, if that's your intention, even in this day and age, when you get a tattoo or a piercing or cutting or whatever it is, you're going to be wrong if that's your intention. So I think on that level we can use that passage as a valid argument. But other than that, I don't know. The video came across to me the same way. It's very slanted and presenting really arguments that weren't arguments at all. And that's frustrating. Not only is it frustrating, but it is very off-putting, as Polly put out. And my first intention, I will tell you this, was to not play the video at all, but to skip right over it. But then I thought to myself, if we're going to be mature in our faith, we're going to encounter people who have differing opinions. And sometimes those people who have different opinions, if we were all wearing badges, would say Churches of Christ, because you're not going to agree with everybody. But we need to be mature enough in where we stand in our spiritual condition to be able to hear other people's arguments and formulate our own back and have that conversation. If we don't, then we're in a world of hurt. And if we can't honestly and openly talk about things that are difficult, after all, if you boil it down to a personal level, you're talking about, the founder of our faith saying things like, if you have aught against your brother, leave your gift at the altar and go and settle it between he and thee. That doesn't sound like a very comfortable conversation. So we need to have uncomfortable conversations, especially when it comes to, folks who are in a position where they're talking to, kids or people who are in vulnerable positions. We need to be able to talk to them and give them reasonable and advice that makes sense. And unfortunately, sometimes that just doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. Now, I think another thing that he does right is that he says that there are overarching principles that kind of dictate whether or not you should or shouldn't get a tattoo. He doesn't make it very clear, however, that these are overarching principles that you must ask of you. And he fails to mention a couple other overarching principles that I think are vitally important. One was brought up, many, many times here today, and that is, it's not your job to judge anybody else in matters where God has not spoken. You remember, people, the Bible does say, don't judge based on appearance, but then it goes on to say something else, right? Judge what? Righteous judgment. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means where God has said something is right, or where God has said something is wrong, then we need to be making the same discernment that God is making, right? Well, as Sam pointed out, God hasn't said anything about this, really, except in that one instance where the intention was obviously ungodly and counterproductive to spirituality. So I think generally speaking, when it comes to this topic on a wholesale level, anything that's going to fall into the ungodly category, and typically that's obvious. That's pretty obvious. I mean, if you are getting, the head of the devil with a bubble above him saying, "Welcome home," on your shoulder, then obviously something's not right. And there's a spiritual issue there. And we're letting it be known. Okay? But in all other matters here, it's going to become a personal thing. I don't have the right to look at, your tattoo and say, well, you're just an ungodly person. Now, okay, does culture associate certain things with tattoos? Yeah, maybe so. Some do, some don't. Kind of depends on where you live. But that has nothing to do with what the Bible says about it. That's just weakness of man, and our tendency to want to judge other people. But we as Christians need to be above that. And we need to strive to not be or have that kind of pharisaical mindset about these types of things. And the last thing that I had to say, because you guys covered most of it, was what Polly brought up. That, if we see tattoos and we begin with, if that's our first conversation and our first conversation with somebody is condemning, and Shirley pointed that out too, we're going to have a hard time winning that person to Christ. And if they have a spiritual issue that led to that tattoo, and that was their original intention, I'm rebelling against God, and here it is on my arm. How are you ever going to win that person by starting there? That's typically not a right place to go. It's funny. People will sit in the most heinous and ungodly places if they feel loved. You make people feel loved, and they'll do a lot of things. I mean, how do you think these cults and things flourish? Because they feel accepted and loved. The ultimate place of acceptance and love ought to be Christ Church. And that doesn't begin with you're going to hell because of your tattoo. Typically. Now, someone came to me, I'm like Bill. I'd tell you, don't do it. Wait. Give it X amount of time, then see if you want to do it. Because, well, number one, it is painful. Number two, there is risk involved. But all of those things are practical purposes. So, anyhow, Mike.
I got one more thing. It can also be.
You just want the last word, man.
You were doing a good job. It can be a way of evangelism as well. Because, one of my tattoos is a memorial tattoo of a person that was supposed to be passed away that was a good Christian. So people ask me about it. Oh, what's that verse? What's wrong with 6:28? So I have it as a way to talk to people. For the past 13 years that I've had on those, I couldn't tell you how many people I've had that conversation with. And I couldn't tell you what that ripple effect was. But it was better than before. So, you can look at it and say they're evil, shouldn't do it, but they can also be a tool to spread the word as well.
Okay. All right. Anyone else? Final word? I think that was the second bell. All right. We're done. Appreciate everybody's input and thoughts about it. Come back next week. We'll continue our series.